others will join hopefully when they can. So for good afternoon or evening actually, let me introduce our guest speaker, Norman Stockwell. First of all, thank you, Norman, for being here. You were unwell and you found time to speak to the students at Ithaca College. Norman Stockwell actually needs no introduction. He's one of the most well-recognized progressive publisher and journalist in the U.S. He's a long time publisher of the Progressive magazine, which is a 111 year old Madison-based bi-monthly magazine. Prior to that, he served for over 2 decades as WORT's operations coordinator. He worked at the station in music and news programming since 1983. In addition to working as a journalist in the US, Cuba, Nicaragua, Mexico, Norman has been involved in the collective management of 2 Madison institutions, Lakeside Press and Mifflin Street Co-op. He's also the former director of Old Town School of Folk Music, Madison, and served in the 1970s as the facilities manager for the Northwestern University's archaeological program. Norman Stockwell has been hosting programs of a public affair since 1989, covering issues such as the murder of Jesuits in El Salvador, the Gulf War and its aftermath, the pro-democracy movement in Nepal, and the uprisings in Mexico. And he has a long list of achievements which I'll just post on the chat section, and you can go through his detailed biography. But needless to mention, we are really privileged and honored to have him and host him this evening. And over to you, Norman, with your talk, and hopefully when you end, we'll have some questions and answers, with the students here. So please begin.
Well, thank you. Thank you so very much. And I'm sorry that this is not, that this is virtual rather than in person. My original intent had been to have this happen live in the studio with all of you. And so I wish that we could have made that take place, but because the world of COVID-19 and so on, it's reduced to this virtual. I'm sorry, I'm just playing with my audio here for 1 second at my end. Give me 1 minute to try and get this working. So I want to talk a little bit about why independent media is important. And, perhaps for you folks, that question is not a big surprise. I think that, in the United States right now, we're really facing a time in which truth is in question, in which truth itself is being questioned. And we've seen that particularly during the past 4 years with the current administration, where the current president, Donald Trump, since his campaign of 2016, has attacked the media as being fake news. But also, I think that what we've seen happen in the world of social media in the past probably 15 years has really changed the dynamic of how we perceive what is truthfulness. I want to talk a little bit about the history of independent media in this country. And, if you go back to the very early beginnings of the United States, what you see is that the founding fathers, as we tend to call them, but really it was, a group of revolutionaries who decided to create this new country. And they felt from the very start that a democratic media system is essential in order to have a democratic society. And so from the very beginning, Benjamin Franklin and the founding of the U.S. Postal Service in 1775, the notion of supporting media to provide news and information to people in order to make them more educated voters was really a goal. And so you had throughout the early history of the United States, you had small farming communities across the country where people were getting sometimes 2, 3, 4 newspapers delivered to their homes every day or every week, depending on the paper. But all of this subsidized through the Postal Service, and that was part of the genius of Benjamin Franklin and some of the other early framers of our political system. And the idea was, at that time, all of these different newspapers had a point of view. And you still see that reflected today in some of the names of the newspapers. You have, the Arizona Republican and the Kansas City Democrat and whatever. These newspapers had a point of view that they were expressing. And you, as a citizen, were expected to look at all these different points of view and make your own judgment, to make your own informed judgment based on all these different points of view that you were reading. And this also, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, took the form of a very multilingual press. And that's why you had these huge labor demonstrations like the Haymarket protest in Chicago in 1886, where people were speaking 80 different languages, and the posters for the event were written in a multitude of different languages, and the newspapers of the day were written in all these different languages. And so people could get an understanding of what was going on in their world. Moving forward in the 20th century, you find a shift that occurred, and that was in part due to the commercialization of media. When advertising became the main source of income for newspapers, suddenly you had editors that were becoming much more shy about taking a position because they didn't want to offend their particular advertising clients. And so you see this this transition to this idea of objectivity in journalism. And I know that many of you are journalism students, so I always start by breaking down the construct that so many of you are taught in journalism schools, which is that you have to be objective. Well, in fact, none of us are perfectly objective. None of us are a blank slate. Everyone walks into a situation with a particular set of blinders. In my case, it's white male raised in the public school system of North America in the last half of the 20th century. That's the set of blinders that I walk into any situation with. And so as a journalist, your responsibility is to be honest, to be fair, and to give voice to the people that you're reporting on. And so when you go out with a microphone or a notepad to report a story, you're capturing someone's voice, someone's story, and you have to honestly represent that and share that with your audience if you're going to be a journalist. So the other thing that happened in the end of the first part of the 20th century was the development of broadcast media. And first we had radio, which started in the very early 1900s. Wisconsin Public Radio, a couple miles from where I'm sitting right now, started in 1917. You had a couple of other radio stations that started in those early years, and then it exploded. And radio started actually as being experimental, and it also started as being very kind of democratic and diversified. You had a furniture store in a town might have their radio station coming out of the front lobby of the furniture store. those kinds of things were pretty quickly subsumed into a commercial framework, and radio through the 1930s and 40s and 50s was became a commercial medium that was again governed by some of these same concerns over not wanting to offend the advertisers. Also, right in the middle of the 20th century, of 1948, you have this new thing called television that suddenly appears. And at first, of course, there wasn't much programming, so television was only on for a couple hours a day. Now we think of television as being this 24-hour-a-day source of sometimes very repetitive content. But back then, it was a much smaller body of programming, and the television was on for a couple hours a day, and people would gather from surrounding houses and they'd come together and they'd watch the TV in the living room of the one house that might have a television set. But again, the dominant form of support for these forms of media was this commercial advertising. Well, another thing happened in 1949, just moments after television really started coming on the scene, and that was FM radio was created. And FM radio was different from AM radio because it allowed for much higher quality sound delivery. So AM radio could go farther, but FM radio could provide you with a high quality symphony orchestra. And in the late 1940s, there was a guy by the name of Lewis Hill, and he had worked at a commercial radio station in the Washington, D.C. area in the 1940s. And he was very frustrated with commercial radio because he'd be reading the news story and all of a sudden he'd have to set that down and read a commercial for soap, and then he'd go back and he'd read the news story again or more of the news story. And he felt that there should be a non-commercial radio network. Well, Lewis Hill was also a pacifist. He was a conscientious objector to World War II. World War II, the good war, we talk about that today and everybody says, oh, well, that was the good war. But he felt that any kind of war and violence was a bad thing. And so he ended up being in a camp with a bunch of other conscientious objectors where they were breaking rocks to build a highway. And he had a lot of time on his hands to think about what he wanted to do. So when he got out after World War II, he moved to the West Coast and he started a radio station. And the radio station he started was called Pacifica. Pacifica for the Pacific Ocean, but also Pacifica for peace. And he said there needs to be a radio station that's non-commercial, and there needs to be a radio station that's not beating the drum for war, is the way he put it. And so he wanted to get a license, and he couldn't get an AM license because they were all full. They'd all been bought up by these commercial broadcasters. And so they gave him an FM radio license. Nobody even had FM radios yet. And so they had to actually give out radios in order to get listeners. And they would give radios away and people would listen to the programming. This model, by the way, of giving out radios was later adopted by Rush Limbaugh in Latin America, where they gave out shortwave radios in order to be able to hear the Rush Limbaugh program. So it's a tried and true methodology. But the folks at Pacifica felt that they wanted to create this radio network where anything, any voice could be heard. And so they had people, far right-wing people, they had far left-wing people, they had a lot of the counterculture from the Beat generation, poets like Allen Ginsberg and William S. Burroughs and so on. And later, they also became a voice for the civil rights movement and a voice for the anti-Vietnam War movement. In fact, they were the first radio station to have a regular correspondent in North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. They had people marching in the civil rights marches. They had early recordings of people like Fannie Lou Hamer and so on. So Pacifica Radio wanted to be non-commercial, and that meant they had to get money some other way. And they said, well, we'll get money from the listeners. If they like the programming they're listening to, they'll donate to support it. And they would go on the air and they'd say, you know, if you like the programming you're hearing, send us some money. And they were amazed. They started getting these envelopes in the mail with these crumpled dollar bills inside. And that was how non-commercial radio was born in the United States. There were several kind of growth spurts of what we call community radio. The first was this Pacifica station that started in 1949. The next was in the early 1960s, and a guy by the name of Lorenzo Milam, who just passed away a couple of months ago, actually, was an early pioneer of building these community radio stations around the country, starting in Seattle and then moving out across the United States. Starting these non-commercial radio stations that used community volunteers to come in and do the programming. So it's, again, a very different model than the commercial radio model. And the next burst of community radio stations was in the early 1970s. It was at a time of Watergate, when people did not trust the government and they wanted to hear other voices and other types of news. The next burst of non-commercial radio stations starting was in the early 1980s during the time of Ronald Reagan and the Iran-Contra affair. None of these things are coincidental. I mean, it was a social movement to create alternative broadcasting. Then in the 1990s, there was a thing called the low power FM radio movement. And again, this was a series of activists, many in African-American communities, a couple of very famous ones in Springfield, Illinois, and also Decatur, Illinois. And again, saying the programming that you're hearing on commercial radio does not speak with the voices of our communities, does not tell the stories of what's happening to us. In fact, oftentimes they tell a counter narrative. And so these what they called pirate radio stations got started. And pirate broadcasting had begun much earlier. In the 1970s, there were pirate radio stations, but really they were vanity radio. That is, there were people who just wanted to, you know, play their favorite songs to their friends. But the 1990s pirate radio movement, which came to be low power FM radio, was a political movement. And it was about giving voice to the unrepresented and underrepresented members of our community. And starting in 1999, the FCC introduced a new category called low power FM, and they started issuing licenses for that. And now there are well over 1,000 low power FM radio stations across the United States, organized by small communities, serving small communities with local news and information. Now, another movement that I want to talk about that's very, very important as we look at independent media, and that is what's called the independent media centers. And this really saw its heyday in 1999 with the World Trade Organization meetings in Seattle, Washington. What happened was the World Trade Organization, which was basically going to be setting policy for how trade was regulated around the globe, was having its first ever meetings in the United States in Seattle the last week of November of 1999. And a bunch of independent media activists in various parts of the globe said, this is critically important. First of all, nobody in the United States even knows about it. The people in the United States had never heard of globalization at that point. It was something that people in the countries that had been affected by it for years were very familiar with, what we call the countries of the global South. But here in the United States, it was a new concept. So activists were organizing, labor activists, environmentalists, and these independent media activists. And they created this thing called the Independent Media Center, which used the internet. And remember, the internet in 1999 is still fairly new. The World Wide Web, the thing that we're using right now to talk to each other, wasn't even a concept until the early 1990s. We think today about the, the World Wide Web as being this part of our lives that, we couldn't live without, but it appears as a footnote in computer books. If you look back in the early 1990s, I have a computer book in 1993, and at the bottom it says, and there's these folks at CERN in Switzerland that are working on this new idea called the World Wide Web. Well, now it's basically our world. So indie media folks, activists said, here's this new open publishing software that we've developed, open source. That is, anyone can modify it and make it better. It's not tied to a commercial enterprise. And it allowed for the publishing instantly by activist citizen journalists, as we call them today, although that word hadn't been invented yet, to publish text, video, and audio on the internet and distribute it worldwide. And so on November 30th, the first big day of protests in Seattle, the Seattle police were issuing press releases saying the police are not using rubber bullets in Seattle. And independent media activists were going out into the streets of Seattle, scooping up handfuls of rubber bullets, videotaping them, and putting it out on the internet for the world to see. And so on that day, the indie media site, this brand new thing created by a bunch of crazy activists, got more hits than CNN because they were telling the truth about something that was actually happening in the city of Seattle. So that movement then spawned eventually a couple hundred indie media centers around the globe in many, many different countries. Most of them tended to be connected to moments of activism of some sort, protests, occupations, evictions. Some of them lasted longer than others. Some of them are still going. But the main kind of energy that made those indie media centers happen was when they were connected to some sort of protest or social movement. But it also became a way that people all around the globe could get news of what was happening in movements in other countries. We were here in Madison, Wisconsin, learning about what was happening in Argentina during the protests there in the early 2000s. We were learning about what was happening in Nepal. We were learning about what was happening in Genoa in Italy when there was an anti-globalization protest where a protester was actually killed. And this was the news source for this information that reached people all across the globe that were involved in these different movements. So it was a very, very important step in the creation of independent media. At the same time, there was a small group of community radio journalists, many of whom had been at those events in Seattle, that started a thing called Free Speech Radio News. And this was a truly amazing project that lasted for a decade or so, where you had news being written and produced on a series of different continents simultaneously. You had reporters in various different countries around the globe. You had the headlines being written in Oaxaca, Mexico. You had the production coordination happening in Florida. You had the assembly of all the little bits of audio was going on in Berkeley, California. And you had these reporters with small portable mini disc recorders and later with cell phones, which is really totally democratized the production of news, because now anywhere you go, you don't have a big giant recorder that you're carrying around or a big giant video camera. Everything is on this little device that you can carry in your pocket. And so reporters were gathering this news from the ground, from the grassroots, and doing it in a very different way than corporate commercial media has always done. The corporate commercial media model is to go to the top, to go to the White House or to go to the government authority and get the press release and report what it says in the press release. And the independent media model is to go to the bottom, as Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! Likes to say, to go to the other end of the barrel of the gun that's being pointed at these people and to speak from there with that voice. So that kind of independent reporting and independent journalism really has gone hand in hand with all of these technologies. And so technology has really made it possible to do the kind of reporting that was much, much more difficult, much more expensive, and much more dangerous in many ways to do when you're carrying around a lot of heavy equipment in a war zone or something. I used to carry, I worked in the 1980s. I was in Nicaragua during the Contra War, and I had this big tape recorder that was literally the size of a small suitcase. And then I had 2 film cameras, and I was climbing in and out of a canoe. Now you can do all of that with just a cell phone. So it's a very different world for a reporter to be going out and gathering this stuff. And also the ways that you build these connections. Again, I can't emphasize enough this kind of grassroots journalism of speaking to people who are being affected by the policies, affected by the situation, whether it be a climate disaster or whether it be a political upheaval or whether it be a new government policy that restricts access to something. The people who are being affected by that policy have a story to tell, and that's the role of an independent journalist, is to go out and gather and tell those stories. Now, independent media has a very long history, as I was saying earlier, going back to the early days of the United States. In the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century, you had a number of very important journalists, what we call muckraking journalists, who were people who would go out and they would challenge the popular government narrative of what was going on. And some of these, I was talking to someone the other day about some of these stories of journalists like Nellie Bly, who was a very amazing independent woman journalist who decided she wanted to report on the conditions in mental hospitals in the United States. And so she actually got herself committed and was stuck in this mental hospital experiencing the treatment that patients were receiving. And she had a hard time getting out. And then she finally got out and she wrote the story. And it was a very important expose that changed the way that the laws were written. Similarly, some photojournalists, people like Jacob Riis, who went in and photographed the child labor in the factories in the early 20th century that helped create the child labor laws. Well, my magazine, The Progressive, started out of this same tradition. Our founder was a guy by the name of Robert M. La Follette, Fighting Bob La Follette, he was called. And he was a politician. He was the governor of the state of Wisconsin. He was later a senator from Wisconsin. He ran for president. But he was also a journalist and a fierce advocate for the everyday working people of the United States, the farmers, the factory workers, also an advocate for women's suffrage, for the right of women to vote. I was going to see if I could show you a picture here of one of the early issues of the Progressive magazine. This is a calendar that we do, and you probably can't see this, but this is a very early issue of the Progressive. It says, vote shows new party sentiment. This particular senator denounces the merchants of death, and it was an anti-war article, the Progressive was, and still is, fiercely anti-militarist, anti-imperialist, and pro-free speech. And so the tradition that we come out of is very much this tradition of the muckraking journalists that want to expose the governments and the corporations that are attempting to control our systems and to take advantage of the everyday working people of our country through using the laws and so on to keep some people down and build other people up. And obviously this is a story that that is still being told. Occupy Wall Street in 2011, the motto was we are the 99%, the 99% of the people who are being mistreated by the 1% at the top who have all of the money. So the Progressive magazine where I work, as I said, has this long tradition during World War I. We opposed the US entry into World War I as an imperialist war and as the boss's war, not benefiting the working people. And the magazine's publisher and staff were excoriated for being pro-German at the time. Again, in the 1950s, the Progressive magazine stood up against Senator Joseph McCarthy, who was one of the key figures in the Red Scare, accusing people of being communists and basically causing people to lose their livelihoods and in some cases their lives, people who committed suicide because of being called before Senator McCarthy's committee. The Progressive was a very, very vocal advocate for the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King had articles in our pages I think five different times in the 1960s. We had many, many other articles by people in the South showcasing what was going on in the movement there, opposing the Vietnam War. Last week, 2 weeks ago now, was the anniversary of the trial of the Chicago Seven, who were leaders in the protest movement at the Chicago Democratic Convention in 1968. There's a brand new Aaron Sorkin film about this, but our magazine had a reporter there marching with the protesters at the Chicago Convention in 1968. In the 1980s, we were exposing the US role in supporting the death squads in El Salvador before it was common knowledge. We were fierce advocates for the impeachment of Richard Nixon after Watergate in the early 1970s. And so on and so forth. So the point is that we at the Progressive stand on this long tradition of advocating for peace, for justice and human rights, for free speech, and advocating against militarism and against the corporate control of our democracy. And that takes us right up to today, where we are. This is the cover of our current issue of the magazine, where it says 4 more years, ? And it looks at all of the things that have happened in this country over the past 4 years and analyzes them critically. These are written, articles about healthcare written by healthcare experts, articles about farming written by farmers, and so on, analyzing what's going on in our country today and looking for solutions to how we can make it better. And I'll finish here just with a little bit about going back to community radio and about the news philosophy of community radio, because I think it very much expresses this independent media notion. Commercial radio and commercial television, obviously their news philosophy, if you call it that, is about getting more viewers or readers so they can get more advertisers. So they go and they look at the fires and the floods as these spectacular, flashy incidents. The old saying in the news business, you've probably heard, if it bleeds, it leads. It's looking for things that will get more eyeballs to their page or their website or their television station in order to increase their advertising income. Public radio, which was created in 1967 with a thing called the Carnegie Commission, Public Radio and Public Television, does a wonderful job, but their news philosophy is basically the more you know about stuff, the better of a person you will be. And this is good. It is important to know about stuff, but it becomes very much like the game of Trivial Pursuits, where everything on All Things Considered is of equal value. So you give just as much airtime to Susan Stanberg's cranberry sauce recipe as you do to how many people were killed in Iraq today. Community radio has a different philosophy, and it's a more activist philosophy. And it's basically giving people information about issues that affect their lives and giving them tools to become active around those issues. So I use this example to kind of tell the story of how this plays out in a story that happened here in Madison, Wisconsin, a couple of decades ago. There was a big cheese warehouse where they had a whole lot of cheese stored, and it caught on fire. And so how do these different entities look at that? Well, commercial radio, oh, big flames, big fire. The public radio station, because they're a statewide network, they say, well, I'm not sure how that will really matter to our listeners in northern Wisconsin or something. That's a local story. The community radio station goes out there and they say, okay, what's going on? Are there toxic fumes? Are people being evacuated? What happens to the workers who worked in that plant? Do they lose their jobs? Is there some sort of support network set up for them? How do you contact your local alderperson who's representing that district to get more information about what structures are available to assist people? So again, information about issues that affect people's lives and tools to become active around those issues. So that's really the community radio and independent media news philosophy, is this kind of activist philosophy of really helping individual people, telling the stories of individual people and giving individual people tools to become active agents in bettering their lives. What can you do out there as consumers of media? Well, for one thing, the internet is a marvelous tool in that it brings us access to stuff all over the globe. I talked a little bit about these different indie media sites, but you can go on the internet and you can read, the newspaper Le Monde Diplomatique from France. You can read The Guardian from London. You can read Excelsior in Mexico City, or maybe you'd rather read Proceso, which is a more left political magazine in Mexico City. But you can read all that stuff on the internet, often in the original languages, sometimes in English as well. And you can get a much better perspective of what's going on around the world so that you can make more informed decisions about how you live your life, about how you want to influence your elected representatives, about the laws that they're creating, and so on and so forth. The internet is also, a vast cesspool of misinformation, and we're seeing that more and more, particularly in this electoral season. But you really have to look carefully at the sources. I recommend, if you look at a story, first of all, make sure it comes from a reputable source. You're more likely to have accurate information if you're reading from the New York Times or the Washington Post than you are if you're reading from the National Enquirer. But similarly, you have to realize that the New York Times and the Washington Post have their own particular biases as well. And so maybe you want to check and see, well, what are they saying about this in the Guardian? What are they saying about this in, this newspaper from Spain, or this newspaper from Pakistan, or something like that. So you want to try and get as many sources as you can and do your own homework as before you start sharing an article that you stumble across on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And then finally, go out and actually make media yourself. You can go out and you can interview people in your community about their stories. And then you can go to your local community radio station or your college radio station or maybe your campus newspaper. And you can say, hey, I just did this series of interviews with a bunch of homeless people in Ithaca, and these are the stories they had to tell, and I'm not seeing that anywhere else. Can you help me get that word out? And they're usually very eager to work with you and help get those stories told, because you're providing insights for their readers. So anyway, that's a couple of different things to think about. I did several years ago publish a book called Rebel Reporting, which is really a series of lectures for journalism students like yourselves that were done by a guy named John Ross, a very, very dedicated independent journalist who lived the last 30 plus years of his life in Mexico, covering what was going on in Mexico, but also covering the United States. And he was very much an activist journalist in the way that I described. And it's a neat read. It's pretty quick read, but it's definitely worth taking a look at. So I'm going to open it up for questions, and I don't know how you want to format that. I leave that to our hosts.
Thank you, Norman. That was excellent. And I also picked up so many things. So we'll take questions and comments or whatever. So from the students here.
Should people raise their hand, or what's the best way to?
Yeah, I guess they can use the emoji these days with a hand.
Okay.
We're in the new age communication, right? So who wants to go first? Right. Okay. Is that Ryan? You want to ask a question or?
I didn't raise my hand, but yeah, I could ask. I was curious, just what do you think like the future of indie media is, like with the pandemic? How do you see it affecting outlets?
Well, it's so interesting as I've watched the local community radio station here respond to the pandemic, and this station that I worked at for many, many years, but I'm not currently involved there at all. And in response to the pandemic, they immediately created a system where they shared microphones, USB microphones like this, and editing software and so on, with all of the different volunteer DJs and reporters around the station. And then they developed a way where they could use a similar platform to this Zoom call to bring in guests from all around the country and all around the globe to have talk shows about topics. So almost seamlessly, they were able to pivot from being a radio station where 300 volunteers walked in and out the doors of that building every month to a station where there were only a few people inside the building, but the programming kept going, the quality of the programming was maintained, and the content of the programming remained as diverse and as informative as it had always been. So I think, you can say the same thing about what we do at the Progressive. We haven't been working out of our office for more than 6 months now, but we have daily meetings using an open source video conference platform called Jitsi. It's similar to Zoom, and we have our staff meetings that way. We work with our writers using Google Docs over the internet so that everybody's able to edit the piece together. And we're still publishing a print magazine every 2 months, in spite of the fact that we haven't met in the same room for the last 3, almost 4 issues worth of that magazine.
Thank you. Jay Bradley.
Yeah, so you kind of talked about how the independent press has a little bit of a different role in that they kind of stand to be like how to help readers and how readers can become, active agents in the world and all that stuff. But the nature of the independent press also is that it's, not in the mainstream. So what, I suppose, would you say is the most effective ways that you and your colleagues have found of getting these voices that aren't, part of the mainstream to people, especially if it's something that is like not the mainstay of press anymore, which is like the print publication. So what would you say is the best way to reach people in that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly difficult, and there's a lot of hurdles that have been created because, as we all know, I think social media is kind of dominated now the world of distribution. And so if you're not present on Facebook, or if you don't pop up in the Google search, or if you don't get retweeted, you kind of disappear. There was a story just a day or two ago, I think, in the New York Times about how Mother Jones magazine had found that Facebook was actually suppressing their articles in order to promote other points of view. So, there's definitely issues that need to be addressed in terms of how we get news and information out to people. But I'm gonna tell a slightly different story, because I think it's really illustrative of how independent media outlets can get the message out. And this is probably 10 years ago or more. Do you guys know what fax machines are? Okay, so at the radio station WORT where I worked, we had a labor news program. And on that labor news program, every week we would interview a series of local activists, union members, people involved in different industries and trades and things like that. But in the newspapers in town, they were only covering the business side of news. They reported on corporations. If they reported on a strike, it was sort of from the point of view of business. Oh, it's just about more wages for the workers. And we started taking the list of everyone that we interviewed each week and their contact information and faxing it to the daily newspapers. And what we saw, and we were able to document this over the course of a series of months, is suddenly more labor news and labor voices were getting into the local print media. And it was because we were providing the reporters with more names for their Rolodex, so they'd have people to call when an issue came up. And so there's ways that independent media outlets can use the tools and technologies of the internet, or in this case, the fax machine, to get more information out to the mainstream media and to get issues covered. What we've seen in the last couple of years now is collaborative projects. You hear about a place called ProPublica, which has been doing collaborations with various groups and organizations. Similarly, there's some podcasts like the Reveal podcast where they get together a couple of partners to cover a story. But then by doing that, they also are able to break these larger stories, which then get picked up by some of the larger media networks as well. So I think that, you know, you have to be creative in the independent media world. And one other thing I want to just speak to, because you started by talking about, you know, being oriented towards people. And I think that one of the things that is kind of a buzzword now in journalism schools, you guys have probably heard, the idea of solutions journalism. And really, that's kind of what we have always done, which is to provide people with information about grassroots movements that are working to create substantive change in their communities. And so, you know, that's another way. I think we had a story a couple of issues back in the magazine about a community garden project in Chicago. You know, why is that news? Well, it's news because there's all these different things that that community garden project is doing to benefit the residents of the community in terms of dealing with issues of unemployment and issues of drug abuse and so on and so forth. And that story was then picked up by another outlet because it was a, you know, an interesting small story about something that could be translated and used in other places around the country.
Thank you, Norman. Others? Yes, James.
Hey,
Go
Norman. I just want to also say thank you for taking the time to be here tonight. I just kind of wanted to get your take on pretty much like tech giant censorship, like on large social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and when that can become problematic, if at all.
So speaking for the Progressive magazine, we have always been an advocate of free speech almost to a fault. And so, you know, some of the examples of that, our former editor used to say, you know, the solution to hate speech isn't to stop speech, it's to have more speech. And he supported the right of the American Nazi Party to march in Skokie, a Jewish community on the north side of Chicago, because he felt that it would be very easy for government to turn around and suppress a progressive march in a neighborhood by using the same, you know, rules. If they could suppress one side, they could suppress the other. And so he got in a lot of arguments with people over that issue. There were some other similar cases. But the other side of that coin that hasn't really been looked at so much is the money behind speech. And what we've seen since the Citizens United decision in the Supreme Court and the followed up by later the McCutcheon decision is that corporations now are able to spend unlimited money to basically put forth speech that they often know to be false. And one prime example of that is climate change denial. The fact that the oil and gas industries knew in the 1980s that you know, the product that they were creating and distributing was bad for the planet. And they started programs to question the climate science, and they funded these anti-science scientists, if you will, to put forth this notion. And the television networks dutifully lined up both sides. And they say, okay, here you have your, you know, scientist who says that human-caused climate change is having a detrimental effect on the environment, and here you have your pseudoscientist who says that it's not, and giving them equal time. And I think that is problematical because there are truths out there. There are things that are truths. You know, we heard presidential advisor Kellyanne Conway just after the inauguration talking about alternative facts. And, you know, there are facts and there are non-facts, but there aren't alternative facts. And so, you know, I think that when these corporations are able to wield money influence in order to push an agenda, that has to be interrogated. And so maybe it's not a matter of, you know, oh, Facebook needs to, you know, censor this point of view or that point of view, but rather that they need to enable people to better understand what's the source behind this information. And, you know, you see some of that now. I mean, they've started like advertisements about political things. You have to say who paid for it, and you can see if it was paid for by a foreign country and so on and so forth. The other thing that they've been doing recently is taking down misinformation, blatantly false claims about the coronavirus, for instance. And I think that that is, you know, there's a societal benefit in that. I'm not sure how our late editor Erwin Knoll would have responded to that question, but you know, it's not giving people information when you're knowingly giving them falsehoods. So I don't know if that answers everything in your question, but
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Antonio.
Yeah, you touched upon how corporations are kind of able to spend this, what seems like unlimited amount of money on pushing forward narratives that they believe are false. And also how, you know, with the coronavirus, we've seen that, you know, it's become so easy to like create and publish stories. All you need to do is like get someone on a Zoom call like this, record it, upload it, you know, maybe write a script and put it online. It's really become that easy. And with social media, like everyone has a voice. But, and I've brought this up a couple of times in this class before, but one of the things I've kind of feared and I think doesn't get talked about enough is kind of like the repeal of like net neutrality regulations and how it may look easy right now, but as these like corporations like kind of control like the internet, like they're like probably like a very I could probably count the amount of corporations that have like control over like the whole internet, and that's only going to become a smaller pie being shared among them. So like for an outlet like the Progressive, how are you guys going to try and potentially fight that? Because I think in the next decade that'll become like more of a prominent issue.
yeah, I mean, I think net neutrality is supremely important as an issue, and we've seen it's, you know, on the agenda of the Trump administration to totally eliminate it. And for people that aren't familiar with it, it's basically saying that everyone has equal access, as opposed to saying that people who pay more have better access. And you know, that's something that, I mean, we've written about it a lot in the magazine. In fact, I just pulled up an article for somebody yesterday from 2014 that talked about the robber barons of the 21st century and how this is really similar to the Gilded Age of the early 20th century, where you have this consolidation of power in the hands of a few. But I guess one interesting story, and this is going back to the mid-1970s when cable television first came out, and there was a big campaign by the commercial television to keep cable television from happening. And they used to do this commercial on TV about fight pay TV, the monster in your home, and it had this picture of a box that was collecting your quarters. And sort of the none of you guys remember this, but it used to be in motels in the United States. You would have a box on top of the TV set and you'd put quarters in it to be able to watch TV. Anyway, so on the left, everybody said, oh, you know, cable TV is going to be wonderful. We're going to have 500 channels, you know, and so there'll be plenty of places to have a voice for the left. And what happened was instead you got 500 channels of reruns of Gilligan's Island. And the corporate players really still dominated the market of cable TV. The same thing happened with satellite radio. When satellite radio first got started, it was two companies and then it became one. They had a very, very diverse group of producers and owners of stations, because at that time they were starved for content. And so you had more African-American owned media on satellite radio than anywhere else in the country, and than any time in recent history in the country. And then after a certain period of time, all of a sudden you had the corporate, you know, the flip where the corporate entities started controlling it once it became more established. And a lot of those smaller owners and smaller stations got pushed out. So it's almost like there's always this kind of, you know, one step forward, two steps back. Every time we get a new technology, it creates an openness and a room for more independent voices. And then immediately the corporate entities, when they see a profit, try to, you know, consolidate control of that. And you know, the same thing happened with folk music in the early 1960s. There was this folk music revolution, and then all of a sudden it became very corporatized, and only certain big record labels can control it. And now we're kind of in the next phase of that, where there's all these independent artists that are producing things and distributing them independently through the internet. And again, you're going to see, I'm sure, you know, a corporate grab to control that. So you know, all that we can do, your question and your concern is absolutely right. All we can do is be, you know, eternally vigilant and keep looking for new spaces to expand into.
Right. So other questions? So Norman, I have a question. I mean, what do you think about the debate will start very soon? So how are you reading the polls and the signs, since you've seen so many elections? And I mean, I know this one is a tricky one, but
it is. And I mean, I'll say a couple of different things. One is I try not to look at the polls because it's so easy to be deceived, really. I mean, we certainly saw that in 2016, where I and probably many, many other people on this call went to election night parties at 6 o'clock, expecting a certain outcome. And all of a sudden by 9 o'clock, you know, we were seeing a very, very different electoral map. I've also covered elections in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Mexico, where you've seen those elections being outright stolen on election night. And the more that we've moved into computer vote counting, the more that has occurred. And so I was in Mexico City in 2006, and we saw the trend and we saw where the numbers were going. And then 11 o'clock at night, the computers broke. And then we didn't hear about anything again until the next morning. And at that time, all of a sudden, the numbers had flipped. I saw the same thing happen in Honduras in 2013. You know, so I don't look at the polls. What I do, you know, I listen to the candidates. I listen to the people that are supporting the various candidates, and I'm very frightened. I'm very frightened about what is going to happen on November 3rd, because I think that we've seen in the rhetoric from the White House already, you know, the attempt to sow discontent or concern or uncertainty about the actual ballots that are being cast. And probably there's a lot of ballots have already been cast and are sitting in boxes right now waiting to be counted. But how many of those will be counted and how accurate that count will be, I think is worth concern. Similarly, the stories of armed individuals going to watch the polling process. I mean, again, I have been in elections in many countries where there are armed people guarding the polls, mostly from the military of that country or the police, and it is very intimidating to the voters. Well, add on to that the layer that we've seen here in this country with the rise of these right-wing militia groups. They had the recent plot to kidnap the governor of the state of Michigan. Well, we may see more of those kind of things in the next 10 days, 11 days. And similarly, we may see these people showing up outside of polling places. And again, for especially members of communities that are marginalized in some way, seeing people standing outside the polling place with weapons is going to be intimidating. So, all of these things, I think, are things that we need to be concerned about. The debate tonight, I mean, it's interesting that they, decided to have the mute button on the microphones. We'll see. That, to me, that's actually the most interesting question about tonight's debate is, if they mute the microphone of one candidate or the other, does that mean they won't continue to talk? So, we'll find that out in about an hour and a half. But
yeah, sure. Alex has a question. Alex.
Yeah, like my question is basically with how we're handling like not just absentee voting, but mail-in ballots, the fact that many states aren't allowed to start counting their ballots until election night after
most states, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of states. So what we're running into is the very real possibility that it won't just be election night. It will most likely be election week or several weeks of just counting all of the ballots because so many have to be counted by hand now. Like, how do we approach that situation where like it's not a clear victor for at least a week or two?
Right. And I mean, I think it's worth remembering that until fairly recently in human history, all of the ballots were all counted by hand. It's not. And there was in 2000 when they had the big debate over the recount in Florida, and they ended up deciding to only recount 2 particular counties, and then it went to the Supreme Court and so on and so forth. One journalist wrote a book about that election, and he pointed out that during the time that we were debating whether or not to recount all of the votes in the state of Florida, Canada held an election, counted all the votes, and settled all the recount disputes and seated, I think, the new parliament members. So it's not unreasonable to say that we should count all of the ballots by hand starting on election night, and that we should be able to be done in a few days. I mean, it's certainly done in countries around the world all the time. But I think you're right. I think that's going to be the key issue here, is that not all the ballots are going to be counted on November 3rd. And if the Republicans have a large majority on November 3rd because their voters are more inclined to vote in person, and the votes that were sent in by mail maybe lean more Democratic, but they're not counted yet, you can see that as being a real recipe for a dangerous situation. One other point on mail-in ballots. The military in the United States has voted by mail-in ballot forever, since the Revolutionary War, and the votes come in, and they are often not counted for a week or two after election night. We never hear about that, but in fact, there's a lot of ballots that come in from overseas that aren't counted on election day, and you know, so it'll be interesting to see what the response is to the number of ballots that need to be counted after November 3rd and up to the 10th or whatever the magic date is. I'm guessing the 10th actually is what I'm guessing, but then we have to wait, of course, for the Electoral College, which is a whole nother series of layers of chances for things to be changed, because first the states choose their electors, and then the electors have to cast their ballots, and then those have to be certified. And so we're looking at, you know, possibly not knowing what happens in this election until the 20th of December or something. And then you've got, if Donald Trump contests the results and it goes to the courts, you've got until the 20th of January to figure out what's going to happen. And then you have to guess what's there, because the system is pretty messy when you don't have a clear victor on election day.
Alas. So I guess we can squeeze a minute for another question, if anyone has one, or otherwise we can we'll have to thank Norman for his time. And I must say that, you know, he's been recovering, and still he kept up the appointment and promise of being with us. Thank you, Norman. It was wonderful and really illuminating, particularly the aspects of the 20th century evolution of community radio and how people took charge of the media that they were consuming and producing. And I think that's a really inspiring story.
And I didn't even talk about community media around the world, because there's a very, very strong community radio movement around the globe, particularly in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. And I want to close by saying that at The Progressive, we regularly use interns to help out with the magazine. We always have 3 or 4 interns. They receive a small stipend, and we had one from Ithaca College several years ago who was great. We enjoyed him very much. But if you guys are interested in anything like that, or if you have other questions, you know, feel free to contact me by email, and I can even stick my email in the chat here. And I'm glad to talk to people further about these ideas, about careers in the media, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much, Norman. I was going to ask you, but I totally held myself back because it would have been too opportunistic to raise the issue of internships. But that's great, because some of the students who are juniors especially might actually knock at your door for the summer internship. And I strongly recommend, I think being at Progressive is a real badge of both honor and professional training if you are pursuing a career in independent journalism. So with that, a big hand to you, and hope to have you again in person, Norman, next year, and we'll organize that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I look forward to coming back to Ithaca. I like it very much, and I still remember the bumper stickers from the 1970s, I think, that said Ithaca is gorgeous.
Yes.
So
they still are there very much. You'll see them as graffiti. Okay, good night.
good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah.